Welcome, guys. We're back for another episode of The Lock-In. I am joined, as usual, by poker player, author, ambassador, and the show's more handsome host, let's be honest, Dara O'Kearney. Dara, how's it going?
It's going fine. This is me on about 3 hours sleep, so I'm a little bit apprehensive about today. WCOOP is on at the moment, and it's completely messed up my sleep schedule.
You look younger and fresher than the last few episodes. What's your regimen?
I have no idea what my regimen is. Pure desperation, and we'll just get through it somehow. I tried to go to bed at a normal time last night, lay in bed for a few hours, realized this wasn't working, got up, went for a run, came back for bed, and then lay in bed for another few hours trying to get to sleep. So
that's as good as sleep. That's fine. Absolutely fine. We had a cheeky 3 weeks off there. The more observant of you out there will have noticed that I was back in Dublin visiting family and friends. Actually, Dara and I had a few nice bites to eat in our hometown. The last episode of Lock-In was the one we recorded late in June, I think it was, with Barney, Dara. That means we have a lot to cover because we haven't talked about anything in the poker world for about a month. To help us analyse the news, gossip and scandals of the week, we are joined by a professional analyst for a change. No pressure here, Zach. He is a poker player. He is the author of Reading Poker Tells and Verbal Poker Tells. He's a live tells expert that's going to come into play quite soon, I promise you. He is the host of the genuinely, quite simply, beautiful and wonderful People Who Read People podcast. It is one of my favorite shows. He is Zachary Elwood. Zachary, welcome to the show.
Hey guys, thanks for having me on. I appreciate that.
We are delighted to have you on, Zach. Let's actually start with your podcast because that's where I want to go. It's going to be hard to get me off this topic because I'd spend the whole hour on this, mostly out of jealousy because Dara got to be on it recently and I still haven't been asked. It's not a poker podcast per se, but there is a little of poker sprinkled in there. Obviously, that is part and parcel of your background. It would wet the whistle, I think, of a poker fan. But your most recent, or maybe it's not your most recent by the time this goes out, but one of your more recent episodes was on the subject of specifically live tells, and it was with Dara. How was that episode for you?
Oh, it was great. I thought, Dara and I did a good job, I think, because it was aimed at a mainstream audience. So we tried to make it on the simpler side and not get too bogged down. And I think it went great, I think. And Dara had really interesting points about how his perspective of tells has changed over time, which I always think is interesting because people can have different views of like how important tells are. So yeah, I thought it was great talking about.
And Dara, how was your experience of being on that show? Obviously, we would talk maybe nerdishly about tendencies and tells from time to time, but as Zach said there, maybe with a half an ear or trying to do it with a more mainstream audience in mind. How did you find that?
Yeah, it was very interesting for me because what I've done a lot of podcasts recently, I mean, they usually are the same format. They're talking about my career in general, and it's very hard not to just keep saying the same stuff over and over again. The fact that this was aimed at something as specific as poker tells sort of made it different. And it was interesting for me because I obviously knew it was going to be about what it was going to be about in the days before. So I was thinking a lot about sort of how my views on tells had changed down the years and how big a part it had played in my career. And I realized that it had actually played a much bigger part than I probably would have consciously been aware of. And it's also interesting to me, for example, that when people come to me for coaching, because they're coming to me for coaching, they assume I'm some sort of expert on poker tells, which I would not see myself at all. Like my standard answer used to be just go and buy Zach's books. And that's what I do. But that doesn't always cut it. People still sort of want sort of a very quick summary of what I see as the important tells. So the whole area is quite interesting to me. I mean, Zach's podcast is fascinating in general. It's the only non-poker podcast that I listen to, because it does sort of unify how important it is to be able to read people in lots of different areas. And I think that's an underrated skill as well in the world we live in. We'll probably get onto this later when we talk about another topic, but we are sort of in a situation now where a lot of our view of the world and our knowledge of the world comes down to sort of who we believe is trustworthy and who we don't believe is trustworthy, and how good our ability to make those judgments is sort of is therefore very vital, I think.
Well, with that crossover in mind, I have to say, and I said it there at the top as well, your work, Zach, has always enthralled me. I'm always very engaged by whatever you're into at any one time. It's always a good North Star for what's interesting to have a think about. But I have one question. What has been, for you at least, the most transferable, specifically poker tell in real world situations? Is there anything that you sort of picked up at the table and you're like, oh, I see that all the time in all these other contexts now?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think there are things about eye contact that really map over, people's willingness to engage when they're feeling confident and feeling when they're either feeling confident or feeling genuine, and I think that some of that maps over to real world stuff. I'd also say a lot of the verbal stuff, like when I focused a lot on, I learned a lot writing verbal poker tells, like researching and writing that book specifically. And I think, I guess it's hard to say it comes from poker to the outside world. It's more just like general stuff, but I definitely learned a lot focusing on people's speech at the poker table and then seeing how some of those kind of same tendencies show up, like a lot of the verbal stuff is like people hate to lie, so they phrase things in like ambiguous ways, and but yeah, it's a tough question. That's actually a really good question. I have to think more about what specifically poker related maps over. That's a good one.
And Dara, would you sort of similarly have any observations along those lines? You've obviously put in quite a few hours at the live poker tables. Is there something you've seen at the live poker tables that you're like, oh, I noticed that across the dinner table, or I noticed that when I'm out with friends, or whatever it might be?
Well, there was one instance recently where I very much noticed that. I was watching a documentary with my wife on a real life crime, and the main suspect was being questioned, and I noticed immediately there was a huge difference from the way he was generally talking about his life in general, et cetera, when it came on to discussing the crime. And there were certain things you just picked up, and particularly from Zach's book on verbal tells, which was probably the most eye-opening book I've ever read on this. Just the way people phrase things when they're lying, the way they go into an incredible detail. They're actually much clearer in those spots. When somebody is telling a story which is false, my wife used to work as a interpreter for the refugee service in Ireland, and she said that one thing she noticed as well was, some refugees came in and they had incredibly detailed stories which they could repeat word for word, and often the people in the service thought, oh, these people, they must be telling the truth because they have all the details right, but they very quickly found it was the exact opposite. The people who are unsure of details, they're the people who are working from memory, because human memory is very fallible. The people who've learned off a story word by word, they're the people who can repeat it most confidently. So I think that's the whole area of verbal tells and the way people talk when they're telling the truth compared to when they're lying. I think that's an area where you see it has a lot of application to the real world, but it also has huge benefit, I think, at the poker table, because I think even relatively unsophisticated players kind of know now that they should try and hide their physical tells, but they often don't realize that when they talk, they give away a lot of information. And that's one of the things I said on Zach's podcast, when unsophisticated live players, be they just players who don't play very much, or be they online players who haven't played very much, ask me for advice when they're going out to play live for the first time, the main thing I tell them is to just shut up. Don't say anything at the table, because the more experienced players will gain a lot of information from that.
Yeah, and if I could just throw in there, I think a big thing for real world stuff is, I think a lot of people have this sense that physical behavior, nonverbal stuff is like the thing to focus on. Like, for example, if you go to my pinned tweet, I wrote a thing about this fraudulent physical behavior expert. There's a lot of these people that are like behavior experts, and they'll analyze like real world stuff. And a lot of these people are just full of shit. They're just exaggerating stuff. They're pulling, squeezing water from a stone, really, because on all these spots, there's just not much information. But I think the takeaway is that verbal stuff is so much more reliable. When you're talking about real world stuff, it's like multiple times the value. Like, so if you're interested in reading behavior, there's a guy who wrote, Mark McClish, who wrote books on reading verbal behavior and was an influence on me writing verbal poker tells. And I interviewed him for my podcast. And there's just so much more information in verbal stuff than physical stuff. So I would say, if you're interested in this stuff, don't waste your time the physical stuff for the real world stuff. Poker is different because it's a lot of the same things being repeated and such, but real world stuff focus on the verbal. Yeah.
Really interesting. Well, I guess I have a nice handy segue to the Hellmuth Dwan match, which we may have watched, people may have watched over the last few nights. It'll be recorded, I'm sure, over the next few days. People will watch it on Poker Go or whatnot. I want to talk about that clash. Hellmuth's streak is finally over. Dara will be very relieved, as it means we can now stop talking about that streak. Former guest Ike Haxton, I know, will be very sad because he was just deriving a huge amount of hilarity and pleasure from the fact that nobody could beat Hellmuth. But Dwan and Hellmuth have had this rivalry, or I guess sort of makeshift for TV maybe rivalry, going all the way back to 2008, the NBC National Heads Up Poker Championship, where sort of ironically now Hellmuth had his aces cracked, and he had his aces cracked to lose last night as well. But I have to say, what I took much more from watching it last night was railing your feed, Zach. The most interesting bit of this was definitely just kind of having Twitter alongside the viewing and watching what you had to say. I'm going to read a few of your tweets because they were all about physical tells. They were all about, stuff that you were picking up from Phil Hellmuth. The first thing you said is, I've noticed in the past about Hellmuth that when he's making big value bets, he seems to go back and forth between acting really hesitant, pausing. I don't know if you noticed that kind of thing out there, guys, but he sort of like, he goes to act and gets the chips ready, and then he just sort of sits still for a second and then behaves. You said, and then in next value spot right after that, he will act conspicuously quickly. So what did you gain from that one, first of all, or what was your first impression of that, Zach?
Well, I should have a caveat that I haven't watched any Hellmuth footage for years, so that was just based on my remembrance of having I have a large database of stuff from analyzing the past, and that was something that stood out to me. And it's not just Hellmuth. I think people who like to, experienced players who like to focus on tells and live reads and such, some people do have this thing where they'll go back and forth, and it's almost just like a variance. And I think there's a strategy behind it, because when you're doing those conspicuous things, like you're, pausing really long time or acting really, shoving chips in suddenly like Hellmuth does. When you have those two polarities, it can cause your opponents to sometimes get bad reads on you. Like, say you're playing a guy in a game and he sees Hellmuth do that once before, like a quick bet with value, and he's like, oh, okay, that's going to be value. And he shouldn't draw those conclusions, because if you're playing with somebody who varies a lot, you should keep that in mind. But I think there can be those spots, especially versus less skilled players, where they can be like, oh, I've got to read on him now, because it is so obvious, and then if Hellmuth's frequently going back and forth with that, he can catch some people unawares. And I think that works out for him. And we know that he excels in, games versus unexperienced players and less experienced players, like big tournaments and such. And I think that really can play a role. And I think I've seen other people do that similar thing, that like switching back and forth kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're always very conscious as poker players when we do think there's a spot to give a reverse tell. You sort of need to know it's been noticed. So it might be a little overacted, or it might be a little on the nose at times. And I suppose his pauses allow these like little dramatic seconds to pass where the person will go, oh, it's gone in now. I remembered what just happened there. Dara, I know you have a good story about, I think is it Davide Katai, where you sort of pulled that same sort of move on him?
Yeah, the first time I played with Davide, and again, I mentioned this on Zach's show, was EPT Malta, I believe. And the main thing I'd heard about him was that he was just like the best at reading people. And I always see that as a bit of a challenge when people tell me, "Oh, be very, very careful. He can read you like a book." So I got into a spot where I was 3-betting for value, and I decided, okay, I'm going to literally every reverse tell in the book is getting wound out here. But I tried to do it as subtly as possible. And he stared at me for, it felt like 10 minutes. I guess it wasn't 10 minutes, but it was a very, very long time before he eventually shoved, and I snapped off with my queens. And he made an audible, disappointed noise. Like I think he maybe realized what had happened. It's an area, like as you said, it kind of comes down to, first of all, it has to be noticed, and the other person has to also not suspect that you're acting. There was another one deep in EMOP on a bubble where I pulled this stunt on the bubble, and Matt Dobson, who is an Irish player, very, very experienced player who lives down in Killarney, he was railing. He said, I knew you had aces. You were overacting so much, but then I knew that the other guy didn't know that as well. So so it was likely to work. So you always have to sort of bear in mind who your audience is. And, it's fraught with risk as well, because if they know you're trying to do it, then they can obviously get the correct read.
I do want to throw in too really quick that last night, I hadn't watched Hellmuth in a while. And as I watched him more last night, he was doing a lot of that pausing just generally. So when I was initially talking about that, I was just remembering how I used to do it. But I think he's actually thrown in a lot more like pausing when he bluffs and such too. Like we just saw him doing a lot of that last night. So as the night went on, that idea became less meaningful to me. I think he's definitely full of various quirks, and I think he's an interesting guy.
He certainly is an interesting study. You also noticed that 20 minutes into the game, and I think that's been pretty consistent throughout all these heads-up duels, he started eating a huge sandwich. It's usually something. Sometimes it was a burger, sometimes it's sweets, sometimes it's a donut, but this was like an enormous, quadruple decker sandwich. I just wondered if, do you think people at the poker table become more conscious when they're doing something like that? Because I suppose it's always that thing of like, if you're willing to sort of casually eat a sandwich, it looks like you're very confident. Whereas it's almost like he tries to get that over with in between. He's clearly just a hungry man and he needs to eat a sandwich, and he just sort of wolfs a giant mouthful of food and then sort of puts it away and he's ready to go again.
Well, it's I think in his case, he just loves doing weird things because it gets him attention. Like, I don't know if there's much more to it than that, but I do.
The sandwich shop down the road, he's probably got a sponsorship gig on.
There you go. Actually, but I think related to that, I actually put up a video related to analyzing taking drinks at the table, taking drinks in poker. And I'm curious if it's still up, because I had a lot of my videos get taken down. So, but yeah, kind of related to that. I actually had a video. Yeah, it looks like it's still up. Taking a drink during or after a bet, because some people are like, oh, what's it mean when they take a drink or, take a bite of food or something. And sorry, I got a siren going by.
That's okay. I'm just wondering if Hellmuth sent someone for you now. Just
it's like he's giving away all my secrets.
The secrets are away.
I'm in a rough part of town, temporarily. I think for those kind of things, it will. I actually concluded for the taking a drink, and I think it applies for food too. It's like there's actually not much meaning there, because it's one of those things where the perception is that somebody's relaxed. It's like that's a very easily deduced, superficial perception that someone's relaxed. But because it is so easily deduced, that people are more likely to use it as a reverse tell and be like, hey, I'm taking a drink now, I'm really relaxed. It's like the more obvious a tell is, the more obvious people can draw meaning from it, the more likely it is to be used as a reverse tell. So it actually varies a lot when you actually look at the stats. When I looked at the stats,
this is massively bringing me back to one of my favorite reads that I guess I happen to have been right, so that's why I remember it, where a guy, I'd been in a few hands when he had a water bottle, and the water bottle had been empty, like he'd finished the water like in the 10 minutes ago, and during the hand he took out the water bottle, unscrewed, and like went to drink from a completely empty water bottle, and I was like, that's definitely full of shit now. He's definitely full of shit trying to look all calm. But that water bottle was fucking done. And I snapped at the minute he pulled it up.
He's like, damn it, it's empty.
Trying to get it to rip out. I remember that's just come to mind now. But I guess, there's always the danger of bias there, just because I happen to be right. Maybe he just forgot and he'd finished his water.
Yeah, it's hard, it's tough. But that's an interesting one. Yeah, it's like, how desperately was he like, oh, shit, it's empty. I got to keep going.
Yeah, I wonder if that's a bit like the, one of the more reliable tells is when somebody, say, knocks their chips over when they're betting. And if they scramble desperately to correct the error, they're more likely to be bluffing. Whereas if they're like, well, whatever, I just knocked my chips over.
Yeah, it's kind of, actually, that reminds me of a really good one too, where the more likely a bet is to be misinterpreted, the more likely it becomes that person is value betting and relaxed. For example, so if somebody puts out a kind of ambiguous stack of chips and like only mumbles what the bet announcement is, that's a good sign that they're relaxed, because if they were bluffing, they would be very scared that their opponent would mishear a lower amount or something and snap call or something, So it's those kind of things too. Yeah.
this sequence sort of tweets ended with a really sort of quite profound tweet by you, Zach. I really want to get this one over. You said, Hellmuths whining, which is something we all know he does. Hellmuths whining makes his opponents feel like he's already lost, that he's so emotionally broken, it doesn't even matter who wins. He'll be the biggest loser regardless. His opponents feel bad for him, which aids him. Hellmuths' opponents have reverse emotional implied odds. I think that's just wonderful. Can you unpack that for us momentarily?
Yeah, I mean, I was mostly kidding, but I think there really is something there where and it's not just feeling bad for him. It's also like it's a form of tilt. I mean, I don't know if you all can relate, but I've had experiences where I'm playing someone that I perceive as very bad, and they're doing unorthodox things, and they're hanging on, and I'm like, this is just so demeaning. I kind of want to get out of here, I think there's a frustration that can build up when you're like, I'm better than this person. What are they doing? What are these weird things that they're doing? And they're complaining on top of it. And so I was kind of pointing out, like, I think there's multiple things to Hellmuth's shtick that are going on that actually help him in various ways. And there's actually a lot to unpack there, I think. But yeah, I think the frustration of playing someone who's annoying. I mean, I had this experience. I haven't played many tournaments at all, like only a handful, but one of the events I played in WSOP was a $1,500 event, and actually went on tilt because I hadn't eaten much that day, and there was a really annoying player at the table, and I just he was just talking and just kind of driving me crazy, and I just ended up giving my chips away, and I was like, I mean, it kind of enlightened me to like that kind of thing with Hellmuth's shtick, and I think that's lesser examined, and I think there's a lot of things we could talk about with his thing, because his unorthodox plays also, like, I think are the something less examined spots of the game tree and such, and lead to people like taking weird lines against him. And so if he's just being really patient, that can pay off for him, because if he, sooner or later somebody's going to take an over aggressive line, and there can be value to that. But yeah, I think there's a whole lot of things there that. And the dark checks too. We could talk about that too. But yeah, a lot of interesting things about his game that I think many people are like, well, that's just weird and bad. But I think there's kind of hidden value there.
For sure. Yeah, no, he's a fascinating study, both as a poker player and as a human being, I think, too. Dara, before we leave this topic completely, Dwan won 200k last night in that match. It was 100k apiece. Hellmuth now has to reload 200k if he wants a rematch. I'm pretty sure that by the rules of this high stakes duel business, you have to win 3 consecutive games before you're allowed cash out. So that would imply that Hellmuth would have to pony up 800k of his, admittedly, it would be his winnings at that point, but 800k for a hypothetical third match. Can you see him being willing to do that? He's always shown a sort of a keenness to get out at the 400k level every time.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're just speculating as well, because we don't know that it's all his own money. For example, it's possible he has a wealthy backer who's actually making the decisions here. If it is Phil himself, then I think he would be very conservative. He always has tended to be. I mean, he even talks about this in his book, one of the very first books I read on poker, where he talks about, the more successful you are, the richer you become, the more less you should be willing to take risks with the money that you have, because when you're starting out, if you lose a small bankroll, you can get it back pretty quickly. But when you get further on in your career and you have a bigger bankroll, it's something much more to protect. And he even talks about this in sort of life in general, that he would have been much more likely to jump out of a plane when he was 20 than now, because he feels like he has more to lose now. So I think Phil is naturally conservative on this stuff. The whole rivalry with Juan is interesting, because I mean, the comments that I do remember from that original match after he got sucked out on was, well, let's just see if you're around in 5 years, buddy. So it's kind of funny that 10 years later they're playing, and Juan clearly has stood the test of time.
And he lost with aces again. That was fun.
Yeah, it's perfect. Whoever's scripting all this stuff is doing an amazing job, because it was hilarious that he was beating everybody.
Yeah,
and the poker world were losing their collective mind.
If it's rigged, I'm all for it. It's entertaining.
Yeah, whoever's in charge of this simulation, they've done a very good job. From one legend to another, Erik Seidel, bracelet number 9. A couple of weeks ago, the great Erik Seidel won his 9th bracelet, his first in, I think about like 15 or 16 years. It could even be more, which is sort of strange because he obviously had accumulated 8 during that sort of 1990s, early 2000s period. After the win, he tweeted that he felt so out of his element playing online for the biggest WSOP cash of his career. His good friend and ours, Maria Konnikova, tweeted, "It was the best news ever. No one deserves it more than Erik." Actually, in an interview for Poker News, she went on to say, and I quote, "Seriously, the guy is absolutely brilliant, but he's so humble that you'll never get him to admit it. The thing I admire most about him is how grounded and well-rounded he is. He loves his family and always makes sure to enjoy his life to the fullest. It's rare to find a poker player as engaged with life and as curious about the world as Erik." Dara, Seidel might just be in a class of his very own when it comes to the players of his vintage still being able to go toe-to-toe with the very best in the game today. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. I think poker connoisseurs in general, people who are qualified to make judgments on people's games, would almost unilaterally agree that of that generation, he is currently by far the strongest, and he is well able to compete with the current crop of players. He's retained that incredible consistency over his career, where obviously everybody has little dips, etc. But he's always, in terms of his game, he's always been top notch. I guess he's the original get it quietly guy too, which is maybe why he doesn't get as much notice as Hellmuth or Negreanu, etc. And maybe doesn't get as much credit as a result. But I mean, his achievements speak for themselves. And I think Maria, how great is it to have reached such a status that you're able to appoint Maria Konnikova as your representative on Earth, who has to go out and talk to journalists.
Yeah, that book helped both of them a lot.
Send Maria out to give them some quotes today. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to do that. Somebody told me once that the only podcast he's ever done had nothing to do with poker. It had to do with music, because he has an encyclopedic knowledge of hip hop, and so he appeared on a hip hop podcast. It does kind of just show you that he's living he's living a great life, and poker is just one aspect of it. And I think that's, in that sense, he's an amazing role model.
He sure is. Well, Zach, Erik is obviously a great live exponent. That was proven over, 25, 30 years or more. And he expressed there in that quote how out of his comfort zone he was playing online. I'm interested in the modern live game, in your opinion, how big a factor is the live component compared to the raw strategy aspect? How much of his edge do you think someone like Erik gives up when he decides, okay, I'll sit down in an online setting?
I think it's pretty significant. We talked about that when I had Dara on my podcast, but yeah, it's like, I would estimate, obviously the more recreational the players are, the more the edges, but I would estimate roughly in like the 10 to 15%, realm of like boosting his edge. And I think that's quite significant. And I think even when he's playing quite skilled players, if some of those players just don't take live reads that seriously. So I think there's some things that he could be easily picking up even in that crowd. So yeah, I think it's quite significant. Yeah. And I think I read a good analysis of it, of him being basically like, if Hellmuth had focused on his game, improving his game instead of just promoting himself, that would be Seidel basically. And, Seidel is the get it quietly guy and that's really respectful or respectable to me. And he obviously is very humble too, and has always tried to work on his game and improve his game and not take the spotlight, which I think is awesome. And, but yeah, I think it's interesting examining how there can be value to promoting yourself. Yeah, that takes effort, and then there's value to working on your game, and both things take effort and time. And it's like, how much do you devote to one or the other? There's a spectrum there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's something myself and David struggle with as well, on a much smaller scale, obviously. But all the stuff that we do as content creators and ambassadors, etc., that does sort of eat into the time that we have to devote to the other stuff. And generally, study is the first thing that goes. I noticed last year was the first year where I felt that I was spending almost as much time on the other stuff as poker in general. One other point I would say on the whole online thing is I think the pause we essentially had in online poker in live poker during the pandemic. It has been interesting. I've seen a lot of players who had stopped playing online or maybe even never played online, suddenly had no other option but to play online, and they gave a lot more focus, and their game improved technically very, very dramatically over a fairly short time. I kind of wonder if that was a factor for Erik too. You know, he wasn't able to go out and play live anymore, so he was playing more online, and therefore when the series came around, he was better equipped to sort of compete with the young guys. I mean, he's not the only one in that sort of camp. Negreanu, for example, he obviously put in a huge amount of work specifically into his heads-up game in preparation for the Poke Challenge, and although he ultimately lost, gave a very good account of himself in that, and did genuinely seem to learn a lot from the experience, which made it kind of funny that he went off and then immediately lost to Hellmuth.
So COVID has made the poker made poker tougher. Yeah, so then I hadn't thought about that. Yeah,
I think it's kind of made it tougher, and it's also kind of brought the two worlds together more, where people don't necessarily see the same huge difference. I mean, everybody accepts that there are differences, but I think a lot of live players in particular just overestimated the differences and thought, well, online is just a completely different world, and I have no chance there.
I have to say, you spoke to me there, Dara. Obviously, I think you get the balance a lot better than I do, and you still put an awful lot of time and priority into both coaching other people, which is a form of study of your own, of course, too. I know from having done a lot of it in the past too, but also studying. For me, you're absolutely right. Like, I probably only put in a 3-day poker week on a good week these days, and the way I sort of supplement that as best I can, just to hang in there, just to have a game that can still kind of go out on a Sunday and be competitive, is make sure that the little bit of time I do have to study, I do it in a good quality way. I have to say, without DTO, I'd be lost in the last year and a half. I think DTO has been an amazing tool for me to be able to sort of get 15 minutes here and 20 minutes later on in the day and whatever, which is, you can't really do with too many other kinds of coaching. You certainly couldn't hire a coach who'd be willing to just jump in for 15 minutes whenever you had time. And then secondarily, I suppose, run it once. I have a membership to that, and I would watch those videos as well. And I think just making it the best quality coaching you can do for the little bit of time has probably just about kept me in the mix. But no, you're right. It absolutely does take its toll. Now, I wouldn't want it any other way. I got to say, I love all the content we make. And I appreciate, you giving your time, which is much more valuable as a poker player, to as much as you do of it. But it's definitely kind of kept me in the game longer, I think, because I prefer the multifaceted life. I want to move on now to, I suppose, like, again, it's almost like that concept of an ambassador and what's expected of them these days, and what people sort of look for in an ambassador, what the sites look for as well, and in no way to mean that the reason this person has left the site is because they don't. But Krissy Bicknell left Partypoker this week, and coincidentally, Benjamin Rolle, bencb, was hired by Stars. Now, quickly, I want to sort of give some shout outs, because I'm not doing my own homework on this one. There was a fantastic piece in Gamble Online last week by Paul Seaton. Both Dara and I were very impressed, and we tweeted out about this. It concerned the latest bit of poker ambassador musical chairs, we want to call it that. Paul wrote about how Chrissie's departure from Partypoker after 4 years, and as I said, Ben signing to Stars. Both are former guests of this show. We've had great chats with them all over the years. We know both of them very well. Both are superb ambassadors for the game in probably slightly different ways. Chrissy took to Twitter right after, stating, "It's been a great 4 years working with Partypoker, helping to grow and promote poker in Canada and around the world," adding, "I will always strive to serve as a model for other women to play this great game." Dara, Chrissy joined Partypoker in June 2017. Her profile is just as high today as it was then. Maybe it's even higher today. She's one of the game's absolute great players. She won the GPI Female Poker Player of the Year award 3 times running. I'm sure she would have won it again last year had it been a thing. I'm not sure of the stats, but I'm confident that would have been the case. Last year, she won another bracelet. As Paul pointed out in his Gamble Online article, her departure is a big loss to Partypoker's roster, which is now reduced to just about 10 or so ambassadors and streamers. Is she immediately going to be snapped up by Stars or GG?
It's very hard to say on this stuff because, there's a certain randomness or variance as well to who becomes an ambassador and who doesn't. Like sometimes you will look at somebody and think, oh, they're an amazing role model. How come they've never had a deal? And there are lots of people in that camp. It's fair to say there are a lot of people to pick from these days, and also, you know, the criteria for what people get selected for has shifted down the years. It's fair to say. Back around 2017, it was more about if you're a prominent figure in the poker world and if you're seen to be a very winning player. That's a huge plus. That's not really seen to be that big a thing anymore. It's sort of more about content creation and also engagement with the general poker community and with poker fans in general. So it's hard to say. I mean, I think Chrissie is an amazing role model, and I also think, you know, even though she's a female player, she's not an exclusive. She's not just a women's ambassador. She's a genuine online beast. If she was male, I think she would just as likely to be sponsored. So certainly she would be a great addition to any team. But then, you know, it also depends on how much of a priority it is for her and what you would be expected to do. 10 years ago, people pretty much just had to slap on a patch and go out and play, and the big bucks rolled in. Now sites do actually look for a bit more work or content coming from ambassadors. So I guess we'll have to watch this space as far as Chrissie goes.
Well, speaking of ambassadors who churn out the content, as I mentioned, the Gamble Online article also looks closely at bencb's partnership with Stars, who look to be loosening the purse strings, it must be said, and attempting to maybe return to a lot of the old policies, the policies we used to, you know, champion back in our day. Dara, you know, what made them sort of a great site initially and things they really abandoned through the Amaya era. Specifically, I guess, with Ben, he's a content creator. He's also a sort of a coach as well. Like it's not just entertainment; it's an educational sort of thing for him. But he's a great streamer too, much like Lex, Finton, Spraggy, and Tonka. They've got really the best streamers out there, and it's no surprise when they're on top of the Twitcher charts. Zach, what is your take on what Dara described there? I suppose a moment ago, that very clear movement towards content makers as ambassadors over the old patched up high stakes pros.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything really experienced or educated to say there. I think it makes sense that because content is king so much these days, that and so much content is more ephemeral, and you have to keep making it to get attention, you know, on a regular basis. It definitely makes sense that, you know, people are valuing that. But yeah, other than that, I don't think I have much to say. Yeah.
Well, Dara, bencb is obviously the founder of the training site Raise Your Edge. And to quote Paul Seaton in his article here, the incorporation of the training site into Starzone's strategic offerings to their players adds tremendous value and saves them an awful lot of renewal work on a side of their business that has been adrift for some time. In fact, Scott Goodall of Stars said, working with Ben and Raise Your Edge, Pokerstars will be able to provide top standard content and gain valuable feedback and input from Ben, the Raise Your Edge community, as well as our existing ambassadors and partners, to ensure we can continuously improve and provide the best experience for all our players and community. Bring it sort of back to ourselves here for a moment, and pardon that indulgence. We've been ambassadors with Unibet for 4.5 years. We make this show and the chip race together. You are also an ambassador for Share My Pair and most recently Cards Chat. You are about to release your third book, which we're going to talk about in a little while, and you have created loads of different strategy content packages down the years, as well as your popular blogs and newsletters. On my side, I write for VSO News and Upswing, and we are both partners with DTO. We have always sought out projects and partnerships because I think it probably suits our brands personally, but also because I think we saw this sea change coming in the industry years ahead. Maybe we sort of predicted the future a little bit on this one. If Stars are shaping up now to splash the cash and secure partnerships with content creators, do you think it will force other sites to do the same, and we might now see a new surge in ambassadors in the near future?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, you mentioned ambassadorial musical chairs. I think we're also seeing sort of poker site musical chairs, and that, you know, part of the reason why Party signed so many people back in 2017 is they sort of perceived Stars as the market leader as being vulnerable. and Stars didn't seem to be putting too much effort into this particular area of promotion. They were just signing people who were essentially relatively cheap rather than very big names. So Party had a clear strategy of let's try and compete and let's brand ourselves as the sort of old school poker site with actual well-known ambassadors, and they were sort of competing hard on all fronts. Now, what seems to have happened with Party in the last year is they've very much stepped back from that, and there's been a lot of talk in the industry about Party's decline in numbers over the last year. I think according to the latest Poker Scout numbers, they're now down to number 10. So like, not only are they not competing to be number one anymore, and GG have kind of come out of left field and proven to be the main competitor to Stars. They almost seem to have given out the ghost, and they're just trying to hang on to a top 10 spot. Chrissie is not the first Party pro to leave recently. Jason Kuhn left shortly before that as well, and it seems to be that they're just sort of like letting the clock run down on their existing contracts, and they're going to move forward with a very slim team. So I think Party have made a decision that it wasn't cost effective for them to continue the same model. And I think other smaller sites, just because Stars is now throwing money at it and decides and thinks that it's worth their while, doesn't mean that every small site will suddenly think, okay, we need lots of ambassadors and we'll sign lots of people too. I think all that's happened is essentially Stars have shifted strategy, Party have shifted strategy, and I think Stars have been very much spurred into action by the rise of GG. Even though Party were sort of going for it back in 2017, I don't think there was ever a sense that people thought that Party might actually become the biggest site. They gave it their best shot, and certainly they ran some very big live events. But GG is a different kettle of fish. GG is so close now that it's they're almost joint number ones, and you could certainly see a situation where if Stars continued to rest on their laurels and not put too much money back, GG could have actually surged clear them. There was a period in the poker history where Full Tilt and Stars were running neck and neck as well. They were sort of joint, and then Stars clearly pulled clear by using a lot of the strategies that we're seeing now. They're doing. It is good to see Stars sort of putting money back into the ecosystem and actually believing in poker again. A lot of the noises coming out of Stars, say 5 years ago, was we think online poker is going to die anyway. So why put too much effort into resuscitating it? Let's just squeeze as much money out of it as long as we can. Whereas now the word coming from Stars is sort of, we're going for it again. We want to regain our unrivaled number one position.
Yeah, and whether that was genuine sort of market research making them decide that poker was on its last legs, or just the sort of short-term interest of Amaya, who did look to be just getting into a company to flip it. It does seem like either way that is what they did for a period of time, and it's good to see the market leader in the game we love so much, really putting something back in now, and I hope that continues. We turn now to, I guess, the hottest topic of the last fortnight or so, as the WSOP's now infamous Rule 115 looked like it was going to ruin the series for vaccinated and unvaccinated people alike. The WSOP published their rules for the upcoming series, which starts in September, right there at the end of September, one of which suggested that the WSOP had the right to evict anyone from the tournament at any time without paying them their payout or equity value of their stack if they'd come into contact with another person who tested positive for COVID. Recent guest on the lock-in and resident WSOP SAR, Kev Math, pointed to the rule. I'm going to read it now. Pardon, it's in quite small print on my page here, so I'm going to have to squint a bit. In accordance with guidelines promulgated by the Centers for Disease Control, the Rio reserves the right to remove any participant from the WSOP event at any time prior to or during the WSOP event in its sole and absolute discretion for any health or safety reasons, including but not limited to if the participant is determined by the Rio in its sole discretion to have received a positive test result for COVID-19 or come into close proximity within 6 feet of somebody who has done so. Now, I'm not going to go through all of that because it's quite long, but the gist of it essentially is that such a rule would have rendered the WSOP nigh on impossible to run. Zach, could you imagine it? There's been some changes since, but like as we were a few weeks ago when this was first coming out, could you see anyone in the right mind sort of thinking, I'll get into this? No backers are going to put some horses into the WSOP if they think someone sneezed on them 2 days ago and they could have all their equity taken off them.
I hadn't heard that. That's pretty weird to me. Like, yeah, it seems way too general and scary, and I would think they would come up with a more specific way to phrase it to be like, to not make it sound so scary and give you some money back in certain situations or whatever. It just seems that seems pretty bad. Yeah.
Well, they were keeping an eye on clarification here, because I guess everybody just went off the deep end for those maybe day or two. It was about a day or two. I think everyone was losing their mind. I was in Dublin having a nice holiday, trying to detach from the poker world, but I couldn't help but be pulled into this story. The poker community were naturally outraged at this prospect, which threatened to make the series a complete farce, to be honest. This led to the WSOP issuing a statement about the rule, essentially saying that the rule only applied to unvaccinated players. Now, we've a new problem or a new scandal to emerge. Cue Krissy Bicknell, who we mentioned earlier, and her fiance, I think, Alex Foxen, to speak out on what they perceive to be, in this case, a prejudice against people who have made a conscientious choice not to get vaccinated. Alex said when they require a vaccine to be around others who are vaccinated, knowing it doesn't prevent the spread. Yes, science. Just more proof that the WSOP isn't about health. I will boycott the WSOP until this disgustingly discriminatory, historically ignorant first step down the slippery slope rule is changed. I encourage others to do the same. That sparked a debate with dozens of people chiming in on Twitter. Chrissie was one of them, and she backed up Alex's viewpoint, saying, vaccines aren't foolproof, masks are useless. If you're so concerned about not spreading or contracting COVID, you should certainly not be attending the WSOP. Someone not taking the vaccine isn't selfish nor pathetic. Medical fascism, however, is. Dara, do Alex and Chrissie have any point here?
I mean, this is a really controversial issue, and within our group, it's fair to say most people are very pro-vaccine and don't really have any concerns. So we haven't really been exposed to the other side. But I do have some friends who are sort of in a similar boat to Chrissie. And one thing I want to be careful is there's a tendency when these debates break out to sort of dismiss the other side as stupid or irresponsible, and we all sort of polarize, and we then scream at each other from our polls. So I don't think that's particularly useful, and Twitter is amazing for how quick that happens. It was no surprise the way that thread was going to degenerate. I was thinking about this recently, and like, if you think about the history of human development, our earliest ancestors needed to be able to do everything. You had to be able to find your own food, kill your own food if you weren't vegetarian, forage if you were, etc. And then we've gradually, over our development and the rise of our civilization, become more and more specialized, and we reached a stage where most of us are expert in in one or two very, very small areas, if even that. A lot of us aren't actually expert in anything, and we are forced to rely on people who are experts in all the other areas of the very complex world that we live in now. So we delegate, but that's not something which really comes natural to us. We have a sort of a natural suspicion of handing over control, and I think probably the most significant thing that has happened in the last period is the rise of the internet. And now, anybody with access to Google can suddenly feel like that they're an expert on almost anything. They're doing a deep dive into pandemics or Afghanistan or whatever. And
what if it's a really deep dive, though? There, they really dive deep.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of my college professors who used to say that there's a massive difference. People think that just reading the book is education, and just reading the book isn't education. And I think we are kind of at that stage now where people think just because they've gone off and they've read a lot of websites and read a lot of information on stuff, they're incredibly well educated, and somehow that they're better than the actual experts who've maybe devoted their entire life to it. In terms of the pandemic, myself and my wife have taken most of our advice from a German friend of ours who is a professor in the area and has been expert all his life, sort of devoted his life to this area. And he has credibility in our eyes because during the last pandemic, the SARS pandemic, he told us on no account get the vaccine. This is not a safe vaccine. The shortcuts have been taken here. So that sort of put us in the mindset, well, okay, he's telling it like it is. But, we also trust him, obviously. We know him personally, and therefore we trust him. On this vaccine, he said, this is his advice right from the start was this is the most safest vaccine ever. The amount of testing that's been put into this is unprecedented. So he was a very early adopter of the vaccine. I do understand that people are suspicious because it's a new technology. But I am, I've had people try to debate this with me, and my point is always the same. I'm not an expert in this area. I'm not qualified to have a debate in this area. I have just decided that I trust the people who are the professionals in the area, the Dr. Fauci's, the EMA, the FDA, all these people. I just don't buy the idea that there's this vast conspiracy between big pharma and all of these organizations. I think a lot of the people who see corruption at every turn and talk about, the self-interest of big pharma is to push this stuff at us. I think a lot of them never actually worked in a corporation. The idea that you could get so many people together for an orchestrated conspiracy is just laughable to me, having worked in corporations where I just see how incompetent people are and how immediately self-motivated they are. You can't get them on the same page about anything. Everybody's just kind of thinking about themselves and their own narrow self-interests. So I don't have the kind of mindset which thinks a big conspiracy is very likely. But then, poker, I think, self-selects for people who are suspicious of authority, are suspicious of, won't just take somebody on the basis that they've gone off and got a college degree and therefore they're expert on it. So I think that's why we are seeing quite a lot of those people in the poker world. But I go back to my point, I'm not an expert on this, so I really can't make any sort of intelligent judgment on how valid Chrissy and Alex's points are.
Yeah, I have to say, I think my trigger word these days is research. When someone says I research something, it really annoys me at the moment because their definition of, I suppose the word research is sort of malleable enough that their definition of research is I spent 20 hours reading things that Google found for me. And research is actually peer researched, things being tested dozens and dozens and hundreds of times. And then that, data being shown to people who are also expert and everyone agreeing that what you've done is worthwhile and deserved of being published. And then even the publishing is another, phase of that. So I think we use that word wrong a lot in sort of everyday language now, which tries to matter. Anyway, this is obviously, this rule by the WSOP, to bring it back to poker, is a controversial one in the sense that it feeds into this great debate, I guess, in the world, but probably very much in the US right now. And that is sort of the ethics of a vaccine passport. Zach, where do you find yourself on the spectrum of all of this stuff? And then picking up on something Dara said as well, when you were last on the chip race, spoke to us about depolarizing, if you like. How do you kind of come away from your polemic? How do you come away from your sort of core beliefs to, I suppose, maybe even more than just entertain other people's ideas and try to find more common ground?
Yeah, I think, I have a lot to say on this, and it ties very much into the vaccine stuff, ties very much into polarization stuff, which is what I talk a lot about on my podcast. But yeah, I think the focus on the issues, the focus on vaccine hesitancy or anybody's specific issue, I think is, and a lot of issues in general, we tend to talk about the issue and the research and the information, but it's to me, there's the much deeper thing that's going on here is this us versus them feeling that the world is divided into the good and the bad. And I think how this plays out is almost an arbitrariness of people's sensitivities. For someone to say that the WSOP is being fascistic in requiring vaccines, I mean, that's a private company. Is it fascistic for them to require a gun ban at the event? Is it fascistic for an airport to say you can't fly when you're sick? These are all kind of arbitrary choices that private companies make. And I think people's focus on you're violating my rights. I mean, you could society is built on kind of almost at some point, these are kind of arbitrary decisions that must be made, right? And so for people to focus so much on these, whether it's a law or whether it's a private company policy, at the end of the day, there's going to be pretty arbitrary things that happen, like drug laws, for example. We can talk all day about various drug laws. Are they right? Are they wrong? Is a specific one right or wrong? And none of us are going to ever agree on the various laws that are set. At the end of the day, there's going to be some arbitrary point, and it'll vary on the people that make the laws in the specific region will vary on the people that make the laws at that specific time. I mean, society and private company policy is just people trying to figure out what to do. I mean, there's clearly a pandemic. I don't think even Foxen and Bicknell would deny that. Maybe maybe they would. I don't know, but maybe they deny the seriousness. But can they deny that people perceive that there's a pandemic and are trying to do things to combat it? I mean, even if you're skeptical, you can kind of understand, like, well, even if I disagree with them, people are just trying to combat a thing that they perceive as real. Like, I mean, Foxen could just as easily get mad at a slew of number of other things that private companies set. Like, I want to carry my gun on the plane, or, whatever random thing it is. It's like, it's almost like we've become these rabbit holes in this us versus them mentality, which has taken over so many people these days. That's what sets us up to be intolerant of, like, these kind of, things that are just common in society, drawing a line somewhere, right? These are just things that have to happen. And it's almost like it's the emotional aspect of these things which lead to people suddenly being like, you are evil for doing this to me. And it's like, the main thing is not the issue. It's the feeling that someone's out to get you, and that's what's become the focus. And I could go on all day about that, but that's the kind of stuff I'd like to talk about on the podcast. It's these, I think the psychology, and polarization researchers agree. They talk about, we don't suffer so much about a polarization on the issues. We suffer from what they call affective polarization or emotional polarization, which is this feeling of, like, separating the world into good and bad, good versus evil. And I think that's really at the heart of it. And I sent a message to Foxen because I was like, I do have empathy for it. It's so easy to go down rabbit holes these days of various ideas. I mean, I've done that and had to pull myself back and being like, wait a second, is this real? I got to go question things more. And I think, one thing I would say is, like, people tend to be like, well, we have to get people to believe the right information. And I think that's the wrong focus, because what we actually need is just people to be as skeptical across the board as they are of the stuff that they're most skeptical of, right? So if they're skeptical of something over here, they need to apply that skepticism to the things that they're consuming. And, like, for example, the stuff they're consuming is what they call this VAERS database stuff, which is, behind a lot of the vaccine skeptical stuff, which is this really messy set of data, which anybody can report data to about problems related to the vaccine. So, if they applied the skepticism they have equally across the board, and I would say if everybody did that, we'd be in a much better place. And I think that messaging is much more useful, because people, the people that are most polarized on issues are skeptical of some things already. So we just need to get them to apply that skepticism more equally.
I love how you put that. I think, in fairness as well, I should point out another tweet of Chrissy's, who said, can we please stop calling it an anti-vax movement? I am anti-mandates, passports, anti-medical fascism, and anti-lies from the CDC, FDA, and government bodies who we're supposed to be trusting. Now, I suppose I wanted to make that clear, because I suppose she wants to make a distinction there between an anti-vaxxer and maybe somebody who is at the moment vaccine hesitant because there's not enough data in, versus a maybe warranted skepticism of, big corporations, pharma, who, have been guilty of things in the past. Of course, we all know about that. That would be uncontroversial. I do think that in times of emergency, for example, governments are always guilty of overreach in some form or of another. And I think right now we're certainly in a time like that where that is possible. But I suppose, in the end of the day, we are coming from a different place where I suppose we're believing the science, and we're believing the sort of, the unlikeliness of a vast conspiracy across states and countries and hospitals and medical staff and everything else that would really have to be there to give more credibility to this perspective. Finally, I want to say according to the latest figures, the USA is currently experiencing quite a spike in COVID cases, most of whom are from the unvaccinated population. This despite the fact that the vaccine has been readily available to people of all age groups for several months in the US now. Nevada, for example, where the WSOP is going to be on, is only at around 50% vaccinated at the moment, for example, and we're only a month out from the WSOP. I can't imagine that number is going to grow hugely. If you're going to get it done, you probably would have done it by now. So, Dara, with that in mind, that basically means that playing the series is a bit of a gamble in another way for certainly unvaccinated people. That it seems downright dangerous for them, in my view, and still not a great spot for anyone who would travel from abroad, who maybe would be, potentially a vector of the disease, carrying it back home. Having to travel itself is obviously a situation where you're in a tube full of, okay, hopefully most of the people are vaccinated on the plane, but still not a great situation for air circulation and whatnot. With that in mind, I know you've made the tough decision now not to go. We've talked about this in past shows where you were sort of 50-50 and then a bit unlikely, and now have fully made the choice. I've made the same one, and I know our good pal and colleague Ian Simpson, who was mustard keen to go, had booked the flights, booked the hotels, and was definitely going to be there, is now cancelled his trip. So any predictions with that in mind on the turnout? We obviously also know people who are heading off to Mexico and Canada right now in anticipation of the series.
Yeah, before I get into that, a moment of silence for the real victim here, poor Rini. I mean, he was desperate to get to Syria. He was the first person I knew to book his flights and all the rest of it, and start asking people if they were going to share accommodation with them.
We should have known then it was doomed there. The minute he jumped in 2 feet first there, we should have immediately made different predictions.
Yeah, he was looking at 9-3 suited. I think this is good enough to go with here for all the money. I think the numbers are going to be very greatly affected. I was talking to this recently with a high roller who has also decided not to go. I won't say the name because it was a private conversation, but his perspective was the type of person who will show up will probably be the riskiest people anyway in terms of spreading the infection. So that's a reason not to go. But then in his words, they're probably also going to be the weakest players. So he was actually a little bit tempted by that, having been vaccinated himself. And
supply and demand.
I certainly had some sympathy for that. I mean, Chris Moneymaker talked about this recently too. He's fully vaccinated, but he said, if I go to Las Vegas for the series, I will definitely be exposed to COVID and I could bring it back and infect my kids. And I think that's going to be a huge issue for a lot of people. So I do think the numbers are going to be very adversely affected. I also think the travel ban is still going to be in place from Europe, from the EU. So the European numbers for sure are going to be way down. I think the number of people who are willing to spend 2 weeks in Mexico or Costa Rica before they even get into the States just to get to the series is a fairly small number. So I think the numbers are going to be down. I mean, until recently, I did think maybe this actually won't happen, but now it just seems like there's so much money behind it. Essentially, the WSOP are series committed now. They kind of have to go ahead with it. TV companies have been lined up, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's going to be a very American affair. I think the numbers will be down. It's certainly going to be a strange series. For me, the final straw, and it became the unfinal straw when they sort of walked back, was the rule change that you mentioned earlier. I was like, well, okay, within 6 feet of anybody, that means if somebody coughs at my table, I'm potentially out of the event. I'm not willing to take that risk at all. But I'm fully vaccinated, so that would appear to me exempt me from that. But then there's another calculation here too, because if you can't be disqualified as a fully vaccinated person, but unvaccinated people can, then the EV of unvaccinated people immediately drops, and the EV of vaccinated people immediately rises as a result.
Dead money.
The markups of your vaccine. You have to show your vaccine cert in your Twitter thread to get your 1.6 or whatever you want for the main event.
You need to get more unvaccinated people there. Hope for a big outbreak, and then you got a lot of dead money in that tournament.
It's so dark.
Not to say, not to make a bad dead money. I wasn't even going there, but that's another element. Yeah.
No, look, the last thing any company wants is a super spreader event. It's going to be horrendous for just the brand in general. I know that's why Unibet have been so boxy throughout this period. The first big major site and company to announce no live poker in 2020. We were the first to announce no live poker in 2021. And we still don't know about 2022, frankly. I wouldn't be surprised if there were further delays in that anymore. I'm really optimistic. I'm chomping at the bit for some live poker. I'd love a Unibet Open in February. And I know that's at the moment the plan. But, it's a changing situation every week. There's new rules. There's new transport rules. There's new country rules. And, you just have to keep an eye on all of that. Finally, Dara.
Quick question.
Go for it, Zach.
The WSOP rule, they would give them their buy-in back, right, if they kick them out.
Nope.
What? They wouldn't even give them their... Yeah, I guess that makes sense if they're... Yeah, I haven't thought through the implications of that. But yeah, it seems like they would give them something back. Maybe not the whole...
It would be a difficult one because, like, if you were down to like a fraction of a stack, you would be heavily incentivized then to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I hadn't thought through the implications.
So, like, how would you implement it?
Yeah,
you also could, in your situation there, obviously, if someone coughed on you and you were vaccinated, you would be exempt in that sense, but you would have to get tested. And if you got tested and you did get it, and there's lots of people getting it. My brothers got it last week. They are double vaxxed. They've had it, done. But it doesn't mean you're not going to get it. You still will get this virus, a certain amount of the time, or certain percentage of the people won't be fully protected and will still get it. Now, there's almost, there's incredibly low instances of death when you've had the vaccine. There's much lower instances of hospitalizations, but getting a shitty flu and being sick for a few days and getting disqualified is, pretty bad punishment anyway in this context. So I think that's a very good reason to at least view it with skepticism. Anyway, moving on. Dara, you have some big news. You have been teasing all week and maybe even 2 weeks ago the release of your brand new book. Could you tell us maybe one, when it may come out? I know it's not in the too distant future. And two, what it's about.
Yeah, what it's about first. I'm not sure we've even decided on the title yet, but it's about ICM, and kind of poses the problems with title, because if you put ICM into the title, people might just go, "What the hell is this?"
Bubbles and ladders. That was my suggestion a few weeks back. Bubbles and ladders.
Yeah. Essentially, where the book is at now is in our mind, it's kind of finished in terms of, like, we put everything into it that we wanted to put in. It's gone out to a number of content reviewers, you included.
I'm only halfway. Sorry, I'll have it finished this week.
And some actual experts in the field.
It's just soft. Fucking open goal there. I left myself.
The feedback has been very good in general, which is the first reassuring thing to us, because there's always a danger. The kind of people we sent it out to are the kind of people who, if they thought the book was shit, would tell us in no uncertain terms, "This is don't put this out." So we've been very relieved that hasn't been the feedback. There will obviously be some changes. Different people have different ideas, and Barry's waiting until all the feedback comes back, because he makes the point that one person will say you should change to this, and then other people will say don't do this, and etc. So we're going to have to sit down at the end, go through all the feedback, and make a sort of a judgment call on what to change, what to add more of, what maybe to take out, etc., etc. And then once we're done that, the book will be ready to go for proofreading and editing. So if I had to guess at this stage, I would say we're probably 5 or 6 weeks away from a release still. But yeah, very excited. After whatever the last series was, and I don't even remember because they're all blurring into each other now, there's so many online series, but I did take a period where I was only playing 2 or 3 days a week, and I was concentrating on all of the other stuff that I had to do, the content creation in general. And one of the priorities was to get the book finished. Another one was to get the satellite masterclass that myself and Barry did for Learn Pro Poker. We finished that as well, and that has launched now too. And all the other stuff, I had to catch up on coaching, etc., and obviously keep the chip race on the road. So I had a period where I really did feel like I'm not a poker player anymore. I'm just playing at weekends now. I'm glad that period is over because playing poker is still the thing I enjoy the most. But I'm also glad that we finished the book. And you're always nervous when something new comes out. But at the end of the day, I think we gave this book our best shot. I think there is some genuinely groundbreaking stuff in it on ICM. We did a lot of work with the post-flop solvers, which is something which has never really been covered before in book form. So Yeah, once we decide on the title and get all the feedback back, and we get your lovely better half to do another great cover for the book, we'll be ready to launch.
Well, I have to say, Dara, I want to pre-congratulate you and Barry on another tremendous book. I actually think it's the best written book by the two of you of the three so far. I did get to pre-read all of them, and I appreciate getting to have the sneaky peeks at them. But I think it's beautifully written. I think there's so much detail in there without it feeling like a tome. I think you've managed to, make it very palatable. You've always, yourself and Barry, have had that knack or that tendency to speak to not just the expert about stuff of a very high level, and I think that's an amazing gift. And I think you've another bestseller on your hands. Zach, any books in the pipeline for you?
Probably not poker related, but I was actually thinking about writing some kind of Can America Heal Its Divides kind of book, because I've spent so much time thinking about that for the podcast and such. So brilliant. I might try to do something and try to make it something different, where it's like, I feel like a lot of the stuff written about that is kind of academic and, isn't aimed at a mainstream audience, so that was something I was thinking about, but that takes a lot of time, and I don't know, but it'll be a while before I do something poker related. I do want to add some more videos to the poker series though. I still have a backlog for my video series to add stuff to, but hopefully I get to that in the next few months too.
You really have your finger on the pulse of the zeitgeist of America, all the problems that ail America these days. And maybe some of the antidotes could emerge from a book like that. I would be absolutely, be top of my list. Maybe even, much like Dara, the top of my list of any non-poker related books. I'd be trying to get that one for Christmas for sure. Yeah. Please start writing that now, and we expect it out by maybe Christmas. Perfect.
I appreciate it. I think it's an important topic. It's not that I think I would necessarily. I don't think I'm pretty pessimistic, but I think the more people work on it, the better. And so theoretically, if I encourage other people to work on it, that's value too, even if mine doesn't do anything. So I just think more people should be talking about the things I think are important. But yeah, congrats on the book, Dara. I know how hard it is to get a book out, and so I'm always it's always impressive.
Yeah, I was actually curious. I should know this because I own all the books. But did you self-publish your books, or did they come out? Yeah. So there's a huge amount of work there as well.
Yeah, and I actually I never even tried to get a publisher, because I think I have a lot of thoughts. If you or anybody else wants to talk about that, but I think for stuff that's likely to find an audience on its own, like poker books, I think self-publishing is much better, because you keep so much more of the money, and it kind of promotes itself by finding, people that are interested in it, and Google searches and Amazon searches and such. Fiction is a much different story. It makes sense to have a big publisher because you need attention, and that's pretty hard to get in the fiction world. But I think nonfiction is a very different animal, especially how-to and niche stuff. But yeah, I think self-publishing is the way to go, and for a lot of stuff. Yeah.
To tie in what I was saying earlier about the fact I'm just kind of the person who naturally trusts experts anyway, and just is quite happy to delegate that. I completely delegated all this stuff to Barry, and Barry was very, very adamant that in something as niche as poker, where you are going to be able to reach your audience through your own social media, etc. Self-publishing really is the only way to go. You make 5 to 10 times more per copy sold, and you're not going to sell 5 to 10 times more copies just because you put a publisher's name on the book. So it's a complete no-brainer. But it does mean that there's sort of extra work there to be done, which
for sure
Barry has always done. I've been very lucky with the collaborators I've found down the years, that they're willing to do all that sort of work that I just see as beneath me. David is very much similar.
Wow.
So he's
I'm really looking forward to editing the next episode of the Chip Race after you saying that. That's great. Yeah.
I'll point out to a practical thing for anybody who's looking into putting out a book. There's a lot of publishers out there that are basically almost like vanity presses kind of things, where they'll basically give you a fraction of the book like a traditional publisher will, but they'll expect you to do all the work of promoting it, which that's like the worst of both worlds. It's like they don't do anything to promote it, and you get a fraction of the sale. It's like that's pretty bad, especially for fiction, which is like the goal of the purpose of a publisher should be to promote it. It needs promotion. But anyway, little practical advice.
That's great advice. Well, finally, before we go, a few little bits and bobs here. Our guest on a recent lock-in, Kev Math, has just started a newsletter type thing called the KevMath Report on Substack. Kevin has been the single greatest source of poker info for over a decade via Twitter and his various roles in the industry. So needless to say, we strongly recommend you subscribe to that. Former guests of the show, Norman Chad and Lon McCartan, are both confirmed. Great news on WSOP News. If there can be some positive news, this is definitely the bit. They're going to be commentators for CBS Sports Network's WSOP coverage this year. They, of course, took over from ESPN, and much to the delight of the poker community, they are keeping the band together. Also, the big online series are on right now, as you all know. But here at Unibet, we have our own big series starting in just 2 weeks' time. The US will be kicking off on September 12th. And a little sneak preview. Plans are in the works for a special chip race tournament on the eve of that festival. Dara and I will be sure to tweet about it, so keep an eye on our social media for more info about that. It remains for me to thank our special guest, Zach Elwood. A reminder to check out his podcast and, of course, buy his brilliant books, Reading Poker Tells and Verbal Poker Tells, if you don't already own them, which I'm sure all of you do. I'd also like to thank Dara O'Kearney for his excellent contributions, as always. Thank you, gents.
Thank you. Thanks. Honored to be on here. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks, David.